Welcome back to the Midnight Screen Files, where the veil between the ordinary and the unexplainable grows thin. Tonight, we embark on a journey into the forgotten and forsaken places that linger at the edges of our world. Abandoned highways, hidden roads, and ghostly echoes. These are the settings where the lines blur and reality falters. Our tales tonight will take you through haunted paths and spectral encounters where the past refuses to stay buried, and every turn reveals another chilling secret. So, turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a descent into the unknown. This is where the road ends and the stories begin. Crescent Pines. The rain hammered down relentlessly as I navigated the winding mountain roads, my car's headlights barely cutting through the fog. This trip was supposed to help me clear my head, but between the unrelenting storm and losing GPS signal hours ago, I was starting to regret the decision. My knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as I glanced at the fuel gauge, dangerously close to empty. Just when I began resigning myself to sleeping in the car, a faint light appeared through the mist. I slowed down, squinting at the outline of a towering building coming into view. It was a hotel, or at least it used to be. Its once grand facade was now crumbling, ivy crawling up the walls. A flickering sign above the entrance read, "The Crescent Pines." I hesitated. The place looked abandoned, but the light suggested otherwise. Desperation won out over caution, and I pulled into the driveway, parking near the entrance. I grabbed my bag and stepped inside, shaking the rain off my jacket. The lobby was like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Dust coated the plush armchairs, and cobwebs dangled from ornate chandeliers. My footsteps echoed on the marble floor as I approached the desk, where an elderly man hunched over a ledger. His skeletal frame and sunken eyes gave him an almost ghostly appearance. Hi," I said, my voice louder than intended in the cavernous room. "Do you have any rooms available?" The man lifted his head slowly, as if the movement pained him. "We always have rooms," he rasped, sliding a key across the counter. "Room 217. "Thanks," I said, hesitating as I reached for the key. "How much?" "Settle in first," he interrupted, waving a bony hand. "We'll discuss later." His words sent a small shiver down my spine, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. I thanked him and headed upstairs, the creaking floorboards amplifying every step. Room 217 was surprisingly well kept compared to the rest of the hotel. The bed was neatly made, and a single lamp cast a warm glow over the room. Still, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. On the nightstand, a worn leather journal caught my eye. The initials LM were embossed on the cover in faded gold. I flipped it open, curiosity outweighing caution. The first entry was dated March 12, 1957. "Arrived at the Crescent Pines today. The staff are strange, but the solitude is exactly what I need." I skimmed further. March 15, 1957. "Something's not right here. The other guests, they're not normal. They stare at me, unblinking, as if waiting for something." The final entry made my breath catch. March 18, 1957. "I tried to leave. The road led me back to the hotel." I shut the journal, my heart pounding. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone, or something, to be watching. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of thunder outside. That night I dreamt of the hotel. The hallways stretched endlessly, their walls whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The man from the lobby stood in a room filled with faceless figures, all of them turning to stare at me. Their hollow eyes burned into my mind, and I woke drenched in sweat. The next morning, or what I assumed was morning, I packed my things, eager to leave. But as I reached the lobby, it was empty. The desk, the ledger, even the faint trace of the old man's presence, all gone. Unease twisted in my gut as I pushed through the front doors and climbed into my car. The road ahead was blanketed in fog, but I pressed on, relief washing over me as the hotel disappeared in the rearview mirror. That relief didn't last long. After what felt like 20 minutes of driving, the Crescent Pines loomed ahead once more. My stomach sank. I turned the car around, heading in the opposite direction. Again, the hotel reappeared. No matter which route I took, it was always there, waiting. Panic clawed at my chest as I stormed back and, "Hello?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty halls. "Is anyone here?" No answer. A door marked "Staff Only" caught my eye. With nothing to lose, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a jarring contrast to the rest of the hotel. Bright, sterile, and filled with rows of monitors. Each screen displayed a different view of the hotel, the lobby, the hallways, even room 217. My blood ran cold as I saw myself on one of the screens, standing in the very room I was in. "You weren't supposed to find this," a voice rasped behind me. I spun around to see the old man, though his features were no longer fully human. His face shifted, blurring like a corrupted image. "You're part of the experiment now," he said, his lips curling into a grotesque smile. "Experiment?" My voice cracked as I backed away. "What are you talking about?" "This place feeds on you," he continued. "Your fear, your confusion, they sustain it." I shook my head. "No, I don't believe you. This is some kind of sick joke." His expression darkened. "Try to leave then, see where it gets you." I bolted, his laughter chasing me down the hallway. I threw myself into the car and drove, pushing the gas pedal to the floor. But no matter how far I went, the Crescent Pines always waited for me. Days blurred into weeks, or was it hours? Time had no meaning anymore. The journal in room 217 now bore entries written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing them. "There is no escape." The final entry chilled me to my core. March 12, 2023. Arrived at the Crescent Pines today. The staff are strange, but the solitude is exactly what I need. By now, I had exhausted every attempt to leave. I tried walking, but the forest around the hotel seemed endless, and every path looped back to the front steps. I even tried destroying the place, setting fire to the lobby. The flames roared high, devouring the dusty furniture and cobwebbed chandeliers. For a moment, I thought I'd won. But when the smoke cleared, the hotel stood untouched, as pristine as it had been when I arrived. The old man appeared then, his face twisted with something between pity and amusement. "You can't fight it," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You're part of it now." "Why me?" I demanded, my voice hoarse from shouting. "What do you want from me?" "It's not what I want," he replied, his form flickering like a faulty projection. "The hotel chooses, it needs, and now it needs you." I staggered back, my legs weak. "What does that even mean?" He didn't answer, simply fading into the shadows as though he'd never been there. I was left alone in the smoldering remains of a fire that had never truly burned. The nights grew longer after that, or at least I thought they did. The windows no longer showed daylight, only an endless, suffocating darkness. I stopped trying to leave, stopped eating, stopped caring. The hotel began to feel alive around me, its walls pulsing faintly, its whispers louder. They weren't unintelligible anymore. They spoke my name. One night, I ventured back into the staff-only room. The monitors flickered with static before showing images I couldn't comprehend, faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been. And then, one by one, the screens began to display me. My life before this place. Laughing with friends, driving here, standing in the lobby, oblivious to the trap I was walking into. "You were always meant to be here," the whispers said. "You belong to us now." I don't know how long I stared at those screens before everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting at the front desk, a ledger open before me. My hands moved on their own, writing names I didn't know. The first entry read, Room 217. "Welcome, Ethan." The Hitchhiker. The rain had started to fall in a steady drizzle as I navigated the long, empty stretch of highway. My wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, and the rhythmic thud of their motion felt oddly soothing. It was supposed to be a quick trip, a straight drive to my grandfather's funeral in the small town where he'd lived all his life. But the storm had rolled in suddenly, and now I was hours behind schedule, with miles of darkness ahead of me. I checked the clock on the dashboard. Nearly midnight. The idea of pulling over and catching a few hours of sleep crossed my mind, but the thought of a cheap motel with sticky carpets and a flickering television felt worse than pushing through. Besides, I'd promised my mom I'd be there by morning. The road ahead was a blur of wet asphalt and faint yellow lines when I saw him. A figure standing by the roadside, his thumb extended in the universal gesture of hitchhiking. For a moment, I debated driving past. Picking up strangers in the middle of the night wasn't exactly something I'd recommend, but something about him gave me pause. Maybe it was the way he stood there, soaked but calm, as if he'd been waiting specifically for me. I slowed down, the tires splashing in puddles as I pulled over. The man stepped forward, his features becoming clearer in the glow of my headlights. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with a lean build and sharp, familiar features that tugged at the edge of my memory. His clothes were simple but soaked, clinging to him as he carried a small weathered bag slung over one shoulder. "Need a ride?" I asked through the partially rolled down window. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "If it's no trouble." I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, shaking water from his coat before settling into the seat, the air filled with the faint scent of wet earth and something else. Something faintly familiar, though I couldn't place it. "Where are you headed?" I asked as I pulled back onto the road. "Same direction as you, I reckon," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Mind if we just go where the road takes us?" It was an odd answer, but I didn't press. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy. He sat with his hands clasped on his lap, his gaze fixed on the rain-speckled windshield. I noticed his hands were strong but weathered, like someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. "You from around here?" I asked, trying to break the quiet. "You could say that," he replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Been here longer than most." I nodded, unsure how to respond. There was something about him that felt familiar, like I should know him, but couldn't quite place where we'd met before. The miles slipped by, the rain easing into a soft drizzle. The man spoke occasionally, asking me about my trip, my family, and where I was headed. His questions were thoughtful, but not prying, and I found myself answering more candidly than I expected. "I'm headed to my grandfather's funeral," I said at one point, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. "He passed a few days ago. Heart attack." The man nodded slowly, his gaze distant. He must have been a good man. "He was," I said, my voice tightening. "He raised me, you know. My dad wasn't around much, so Grandpa kind of stepped in. He taught me everything, how to fish, how to fix a car, how to be decent." The man's smile widened slightly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sounds like he was proud of you." "I hope so," I said, my throat tightening. "I didn't visit as much as I should have. Life got in the way, you know? Work, school, everything." He didn't respond right away, but when he did, his words carried a weight that made the air in the car feel thicker. Life has a funny way of giving us the time we need, even when we don't realize it. As the road stretched on, I began to notice small details that didn't add up. The way he seemed to know things about me without asking. The way the scent in the car, that familiar, almost comforting smell, grew stronger the longer he was there. And then there was the way he looked at me, like he wasn't just seeing me, but seeing through me. "You remind me of someone," I said finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Do I?" he asked, his tone light but knowing. "Yeah," I said, frowning. "My grandfather." He didn't react immediately, but when he did, it was with a quiet laugh, the kind that comes from deep in the chest. "Well, I'll take that as a compliment." The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "What's your name?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He looked at me then, his eyes soft but filled with something I couldn't name. "Call me Jack." My grip on the wheel loosened slightly. "That's my grandfather's name." "Is it?" he said, his smile returning. "Must be a good name then. No merge me flowers." When we reached a crossroads, he pointed to the right. "Turn here," he said. I hesitated. "That's not the way to town." "Trust me," he said. "Just for a minute." Against my better judgment, I turned. The road was narrower here, lined with tall trees that loomed over us like silent sentinels. We drove in silence until he motioned for me to pull over. The spot was unremarkable, just a clearing by the side of the road, but he seemed content. "This is where I get off," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. I stared at him. "Out here? Are you sure?" He nodded, reaching for his bag. "Thanks for the ride. It meant more than you know." I didn't know what to say. "Do you need anything?" He shook his head, opening the door. "Just take care of yourself, son, and don't forget what he taught you." Before I could ask what he meant, he stepped out into the drizzle and shut the door behind him. I watched him walk into the trees, his figure disappearing into the shadows. I waited, half expecting him to come back, but he didn't. When I finally pulled back onto the main road, my mind was racing. The scent lingered in the car, stronger now. It hit me suddenly. It was the smell of my grandfather's workshop, sawdust, motor oil, and something faintly sweet, like pipe tobacco. My hands tightened on the wheel as I realized what had just happened. I reached for my phone to call my mom, but my fingers hovered over the screen. How could I explain it? What would I even say? The next morning, at the funeral, I stood by the casket, staring down at my grandfather's face. Peaceful. Still. My mom came up beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Did you get in okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "The drive was something else." She nodded, her gaze distant. "He always said he'd find a way to say goodbye." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening as her words sank in. I glanced back at the casket, half expecting to see a knowing smile on his face. But it was just him, silent and still, as the scent of sawdust and motor oil faintly lingered in the air. The Phantom Convoy. The highway stretched endlessly under the dim glow of my truck's headlights, a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the silent wilderness. I adjusted my grip on the wheel, yawning as I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just past 2 a.m., the dead hours of the night when the world seemed to hold its breath. For a seasoned long-haul trucker like me, the solitude of the road was nothing new. But tonight, the air felt heavier, the silence too complete. I flipped on the radio, hoping for some static-filled late-night talk show to keep me company. Instead, the speakers emitted nothing but a low hum. I frowned, fiddling with the dial, but the hum persisted. Shaking my head, I leaned back, deciding the quiet would have to do. Then, up ahead, the faint glow of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me. Another vehicle meant I wasn't alone on this stretch of highway. The lights grew closer, resolving into a convoy of military trucks. They were vintage, World War II era, by the looks of them, with faded insignias barely visible under the grime. I slowed slightly, letting the convoy overtake me. One by one, the trucks passed, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Each driver stared straight ahead, their faces obscured by shadows. The convoy moved in eerie silence. No engines growled, no tires hummed against the road. Just the low, steady pulse of headlights piercing the darkness. As the last truck pulled ahead, I felt an inexplicable chill crawl up my spine. I shook it off, chalking it up to fatigue, and maintained my speed. But a few miles down the road, the convoy slowed, forcing me to follow at a crawl. "Come on," I muttered, flashing my high beams in frustration. The trucks didn't react. I honked, the sound jarring in the oppressive quiet, but still, the convoy didn't budge. Resigned, I eased my foot off the gas, staying behind them. The radio crackled suddenly, cutting through the silence. A distorted voice spoke in a language I didn't recognize, the words sharp and urgent. I reached for the dial, but the voice stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by static. The road stretched on, the convoy leading me deeper into the wilderness. The highway markers I'd been using to track my progress were gone, swallowed by the night. Unease settled in my gut as I realized I couldn't remember the last town I'd passed, or even the name of the highway I was on. My grip on the wheel tightened as I scanned the convoy ahead. The trucks were moving slower now, their brake lights glowing faintly in the fog that had begun to gather. The mist curled around the vehicles, blurring their outlines until they seemed to dissolve into the darkness. I squinted, trying to make out the shapes of the drivers, but the shadows in their cabs seemed impenetrable. Suddenly, one of the trucks veered sharply to the left, disappearing into the trees. I slammed on my brakes, skidding to a stop. The remaining trucks followed, each turning into the woods with unnatural precision. I stared after them, my heart pounding. The road ahead was empty now, the convoy swallowed by the forest. I hesitated, debating whether to continue driving or follow the convoy. Curiosity won out. Against my better judgment, I turned my truck toward the faint glow of their taillights, the massive vehicle crunching over branches as it left the asphalt. The forest was unnervingly silent, the only sound the low rumble of my engine. The glow of the convoy's lights grew brighter, pulling me deeper into the trees. Then, as abruptly as they'd appeared, the lights vanished. I slammed on the brakes, my truck shuddering to a stop in a small clearing. The convoy was gone. I stepped out of the cab, the cold night air biting at my skin. The clearing was empty, save for a rusted metal sign leaning against a tree. I approached it cautiously, brushing away the moss to reveal faded lettering, Fort Elwood Training Grounds. I frowned. Fort Elwood had been decommissioned decades ago, its operations shrouded in secrecy. Stories about classified experiments and soldiers who never came home had been the stuff of local legend. A sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts. It was faint at first, a low hum that grew louder, vibrating through the air. I turned, my breath catching as the convoy reappeared, materializing out of the fog. The trucks formed a circle around me, their headlights blazing. I backed away, my heart pounding as the truck doors opened in unison. Soldiers stepped out, their uniforms tattered and faces obscured by shadows. They moved mechanically, their steps perfectly synchronized. One soldier broke formation, walking toward me. The closer he came, the more the shadows lifted, revealing hollow eyes and a face etched with scars. The soldier stopped a few feet from me, raising an arm to point at me. The radio in my truck crackled to life again, the distorted voice returning, louder this time. The words were incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled back to my truck, slamming the door shut and flooring the gas. The convoy didn't follow, their headlights fading into the fog as I tore back onto the highway. When I finally reached a gas station hours later, dawn was breaking. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, my hands shaking. "Rough night?" the man asked, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. I nodded. "My throat dry?" "You could say that." The attendant's gaze flicked to my truck. "You got some dirt on your rig. Must have gone off-road." I glanced out the window. My truck was caked in mud, leaves caught in the grill. But what caught my eye was the symbol smeared across the driver's door. A faded insignia, the same one I'd seen on the convoy's trucks. I turned back to the attendant, my voice barely above a whisper. "Ever hear of Fort Elwood?" The man froze, his face paling. "Yeah, my granddad used to talk about it, said the place was cursed. Why?" I shook my head, my hands tightening around the coffee cup. "No reason. Just curious." As I pulled back onto the highway, the insignia remained, a silent reminder of the night I'd crossed paths with the Phantom Convoy. Ghost Road. The road stretched out ahead of me, bathed in the pale glow of my car's headlights. It was late, so late that the stars felt like they were watching us. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, and the low hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound accompanying us on this impromptu road trip. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, while Darren and Mia were in the back, laughing about some inside joke I couldn't follow. "You sure this is the right way?" Chloe asked, leaning toward the GPS mounted on the dash. The map had been glitching for the past 20 minutes, refusing to load properly. All it showed was the small dot of our car, floating aimlessly in a sea of gray. "It's a back road," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It'll probably connect to the highway again." "Probably," Mia chimed in from the back, her voice teasing. "That's comforting." "Relax," Darren said, elbowing her. "It's an adventure. Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" Chloe rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at her lips. Famous last words. We passed the first sign about 10 minutes later. Hollow Creek Road, it read in faded white letters, nailed crookedly to a post that looked ready to collapse. I barely noticed it until Darren pointed it out. "Creepy name," he said. "You think it's haunted?" "Everything's haunted to you?" Chloe shot back, but her tone was lighter now, playful. "It does sound kind of ominous," I admitted, "but it's just a name." The trees closed in tighter around the road as we drove on, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The air seemed colder, and the fog rolled in gradually, first clinging to the edges of the road and then swallowing everything beyond the headlights. The world outside felt muted, as though we'd been cut off from the rest of reality. "Hey, is it just me, or does this road feel weird?" Mia asked, her voice softer now. I nodded, but Chloe scoffed. "It's a road. What's weird about it?" "It's too quiet," Darren said, leaning forward. "No cars, no houses, no nothing. No service either," Chloe muttered, holding up her phone. Great. We didn't notice the signs at first. They were subtle, almost blending into the fog. But then Mia called out, "Look, that sign had a name on it." "So?" Darren asked. "No, like someone's name." "You're imagining things," Chloe said, but her voice wavered. A few minutes later, I spotted another one. Rebecca Ward, it read, painted in faded letters on old wood. I frowned, glancing at Chloe. "You see that?" "Yeah," she said slowly. "That's weird." The signs became more frequent after that. Each one bore a different name, and none of us spoke as we passed them. The air in the car felt heavier, the laughter and teasing from earlier replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. "We should turn around," Mia said suddenly. "We've come too far," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. My grip on the wheel tightened as the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. "Guys," Darren said, his voice strained. Do you feel that?" "Feel what?" Chloe asked, but before he could answer, the car lurched. The world around us blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't in the driver's seat anymore. I was in a field, surrounded by smoke and the acrid smell of fire. I could hear screams, feel the heat licking at my skin, and then it was gone. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. My chest heaved as I gripped the wheel, trying to steady myself. What the hell was that? Mia's voice was shrill, and I could hear her scrambling to unbuckle her seatbelt. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. Did anyone else see something?" "Yeah," Darren whispered, "but it wasn't here. It was something else." The fog thickened as we drove on, and the memories became stronger. Each one hit like a wave, pulling us under. Darren saw himself as a child, lost in the woods. Mia relived the moment she'd nearly drowned at summer camp. Chloe screamed as she described a car crash that none of us could remember but left her shaking and in tears. For me, it was my sister. I saw her standing on the edge of a bridge, her face pale and her eyes filled with despair. She'd called me that night, asking for help, but I hadn't picked up. By the time I got there, it was too late. One by one, they disappeared. Darren was the first. I glanced in the rearview mirror and his seat was empty. No sound, no warning, just gone. Chloe turned to look, her face pale. "Where did he go?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, panic rising in my chest. Maybe he got out. Mia vanished next. One second she was there, clutching the armrest, and the next, the door was open and the fog had swallowed her. Chloe screamed, grabbing my arm. "We have to go back." "I can't," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't even know where we are." By the time Chloe disappeared, I was numb. Her scream echoed in my ears as the fog consumed her, leaving me alone in the car. The road stretched on endlessly, the signs with names still appearing. Then I saw it. My name, painted in bold letters on one of the signs. I slammed on the brakes, stepping out of the car. The fog pressed close, and the silence was deafening. "What do you want?" I shouted. My voice felt small, swallowed by the void. The road seemed to hum beneath my feet, a low vibration that grew stronger. And then I saw them. Chloe, Darren, and Mia, standing in the fog. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. They didn't move, didn't speak, they just stared. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I should have done something." The figures began to fade, the fog growing thicker around them. As they disappeared, the road shifted. The fog lifted slightly, revealing a path forward. I climbed back into the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The GPS flickered to life, the screen displaying a new route. As I drove, the names on the signs began to fade, one by one, until there was nothing left but the empty road ahead. The memories lingered, their weight heavy on my chest. The road had taken something from me, but it had also given me a chance to face what I'd been running from. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I whispered a silent promise to the friends I'd lost. "I won't forget." The car hummed steadily beneath me as I glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting Chloe to be there, making some sarcastic comment about my driving. But the seat was empty. The ache in my chest deepened, and I tightened my grip on the wheel. The road ahead began to feel familiar, though I couldn't explain how. The fog had fully lifted, and with it, the oppressive sense of being watched. But as I passed the faint outlines of fields and distant hills, I realized something else. This wasn't just a road. It was the same road, looping back again. "No," I muttered under my breath. "This can't be happening." The GPS recalculated, its mechanical voice monotone and cold. "Proceed straight." I slammed the brakes again, my heart racing. Stepping out of the car, I looked around for any sign, any clue that I wasn't trapped. But then, in the distance, I saw a figure. It wasn't Chloe, Darren, or Mia. It was me. The figure stood at the edge of the road, staring silently. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the curb. The version of me raised a hand, pointing at the sky before vanishing into thin air. I turned back to the car, my breath coming in short gasps. There was only one thing left to do. The road wanted me to keep driving, but I couldn't let it win. This time, I turned the wheel sharply and headed off the path, straight into the unknown wilderness, determined to escape or confront whatever lay ahead. The wood seemed to shift and groan as the car pushed forward, the engine struggling against the uneven terrain. The names from the signs echoed in my mind, along with the faces of my friends. I didn't know if I'd make it out, but I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't let this road define me. Somewhere in the distance, dawn was breaking, and for the first time, I felt hope. The open road is a promise of freedom, a journey to anywhere. But what happens when the road itself becomes a trap, looping endlessly through the shadows of a reality gone wrong? Tonight's travelers found themselves caught between the familiar and the unexplainable, where neon lights flicker with secrets and motels hide more than weary strangers. So the next time you find yourself driving alone at night, with only the hum of the engine and the empty highway ahead, ask yourself, is it the road you're following or something else entirely? Until we meet again, drive safely and watch the shadows.